They looked at his coat and saw nothing. They saw the mended elbow, the threadbare cuffs, the faint dust along the collar, and in those small, obvious things they wrote his story. No table, no name, no account worth saving. In a room where men paid for importance and bought permission to breathe louder than the rest, a man in a shabby tweed coat was the kind of presence a city learns to ignore. The lunch service at Bramble and Finch moved like a well-rehearsed machine. Waiters with white jackets sliced through the crowd, cutlery sang against porcelain. Voices lowered into the polite hum of money being spent and reputations quietly reinforced. The host stand was a small citadel of control. Jessica, with her lacquered smile and an inventory of names, kept the list tight. Businessmen flooded the booths, briefcases like ornaments, shoes polished to a reflective arrogance. Sterling Vance arrived as he had the habit of arriving to every room that mattered. Seconds early, laugh practiced, a certainty that his opinion would command the air. Chloe Evans moved through the same current every afternoon. She had learned to read the room the way other people read headlines. Who needed refilling, who wanted to be left alone, whose coffee they would forget until it grew cold and bitter. Her apron hung like a badge of small authority, pockets filled with pens and the folded receipts of other people's afternoons. She kept her posture polite but not groveling, her head high enough to make eye contact and low enough to look like she belonged in the background. The little man in tweed arrived alone, carrying no phone and no presumption. He took the counter table that the staff sometimes set aside for unexceptional patrons, the kind they could afford to ignore. His hands were a map of weather and labor, his hair had the stubborn salt of years. There was a notebook with him, dog-eared and studiously annotated, and an odd, quiet way of watching people without demanding to be noticed. Chloe watched him the way someone watches a page in a book that looks like a different story. There was something in the angle of his shoulders that said he had once stood in rooms larger than this one and been told little things about his place. She thought of ruined watches and quiet hands and the way people adjust their coat like a small prayer against being seen. Sterling, of course, noticed everything that could be quantified. He noticed the tweed and decided it was currency to be used. He did not ignore the man. He amplified him into a spectacle. "Excuse me," Sterling called across, his voice an arrow that cut the clatter. "Is this a private booth or a new kind of promotional piece? Should I be charged admission?" Laughter bubbled at a nearby table, successful people laughing with the practiced cruelty of those who have never had to risk wrongness. Heads turned. Jessica's smile tightened, a manager's reflex. Mr. Henderson, who ran the floor with a careful lightness and a fear that things might fall apart if he didn't keep the fragile balance of paying customers intact, glanced at the table from across the room, weighing sympathy against the ledger. Chloe set down a pot of tea in front of the man, a habit, not charity. "Black?" she asked, the kind of question you ask someone you do not expect to form a story around. He nodded, fingers curling around the warm ceramic as if it anchored him to a place that had the same small kindness he had once given others. "You should seat yourself better," Sterling continued, louder, as if his volume might convert his judgment into a fact. "This is a place for people who respect the room, not for—" He let the sentence hang, and the room supplied the rest. The comments folded into the cloth, people eager to be part of the correction. A woman at the bar adjusted her scarf and pretended to be affronted on principle. Something in Chloe's chest moved. It was not bravery. She was good at not being brave when the bills were due, but it was a muscle of refusal that had been trained by 1,000 small injustices. She had watched Sterling in meetings before, watched men like him hold decisiveness like a weapon and call it taste. Today, it had a sharper edge. She stepped closer, dust of the afternoon clinging to her shoes, and found herself asking, in the language that had been a private altar for years, "Vui hotite chai?" The words came quiet but precise. Vous hatite chai? Vous hatite chai? Would you like tea? The room paused as if the sound itself had weight. In an instant, the cutlery, the conversation, Sterling's laughter, everything folded in on itself like a breath being held. For the man in the tweed, the lines in his face smoothed. His eyes, which had been alert and guarded, softened with a recognition that was equal parts astonishment and relief. He answered in that same cool register, a single, small, rich word. Spasibo. Spasibo. Thank you. It was a small exchange, 2 syllables that belonged to places of snow and smoked bread, and languages that carry the smell of old libraries. But language is not merely vocabulary, it is a key. The way he said it rebounded off the mirrored white plates and reached Sterling's ears like a bell. Sterling had expected his punchline to land. Instead, the room had shifted underfoot. Chloe's throat constricted, not with fear, but with a memory that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface of her life. Moscow at dusk, the big university library, the clipped breath of cold and the smell of ink, her fingers trembling over a grammar textbook that had been a secret she carried like contraband. She had left those classrooms to come here, to pay rent in a city that did not ask about her majors. Lomonosov had taught her declensions and case endings, but it had also taught her what it meant to belong to a world that would not always belong to her. For a moment, the man in the tweed unfolded further. He set his notebook open, and there, tucked between pages of ideas and something that looked like sketches for factories, was an address in a script that spoke of another latitude. Chloe read without meaning to. The letters were careful, deliberate. They told of firms and estates, and a cadence that made the back of her neck cold with the recognition of scale. Sterling, flustered at being denied the expected drama, tried to reclaim the narrative. "Miss Evans," he said, because the world always bowed to the name of someone it could buy. "We appreciate that you take your job seriously, but if a customer's presence deters other patrons, perhaps—" Mr. Henderson's hand, big and soft, hovered at the edge of the manager's station. He knew the cost of bad publicity. He also knew how the floor could collapse if he didn't act fast. He'd been balancing the restaurant's margins and the landlord's patience for 5 years. He wasn't cruel. He had mortgages and payroll to think about. He smiled the smile of someone choosing a compromise and said, "We aim to please all our guests, Mr. Vance, but—" Sterling sniffed, the signal that he intended to end a conversation with a small victory. Then the staff must reflect that. This is a place of standards. I won't sit next to what looks like. Chloe saw the intent behind the sentence and what was coming next like a clock catching up. She felt the room pressing in, measuring her, as if the crowd sensed she might be a variable that needed correcting. She had 2 options: retreat, as she usually did when things threatened to clatter out of the precise order that kept her paycheck predictable, or do something small and human. She chose the latter. She poured more tea for the man, smoothing the surface as if ironing a crease from a story. "Как вас зовут?" she asked softly, watching the economy of his face register again. "Как вас зовут?" "Как вас зовут?" What is your name? "Dmitri," he said. Dmitri. It was a name that had weight, not of arrogance, but of years. Volkov, he added when Chloe's eyes asked the rest. It was the kind of surname that slid over other people's tongues and left an impression of an old house with deep roots. The room noticed the name exactly as the room was designed to notice things. Names are currency too. Dmitri Volkov. The syllables unfolded, and some people in the back rows of the dining room fetched the image of a man from a different life. Tall, decisive, smelling of cedar, and an economy that could steam you with its heat. But that was the room's leap, not Chloe's. All she saw was a man who looked like he could afford better tea, who had been spoken to as if he didn't belong, and who offered her a quiet smile in thanks. She could not have named what wealth might be attached to that smile. It was not her work to decide narratives. Sterling's face reddened with irritation that he had been arrested mid-pleasure. A man who pounced on the smallness of others did not like being outmaneuvered by a phrase in another tongue. "That's nonsense," he said, louder than the table deserved. "This is a restaurant, not a stage for your theatrics. Miss, you should attend to our paying customers first." Chloe folded her hands around the teacup and felt the heat through porcelain. She had carried the heat of other people's tempers before. She knew the weight of a manager's decision landing on someone with a mortgage. "I am tending to my table," she said quietly. "He is a guest." "Then tend to the rest of your guests," Sterling snapped. "You made him conspicuous. I expect you to control the floor. If you can't, we'll find someone who can." The timing was clinical. It was as if Sterling had rehearsed the exact word that would make a manager surrender. Mr. Henderson swallowed, the ledger of the restaurant balancing in his mind against a single complaint from a man who could make trouble with a name. He cleared his throat. "Chloe," he said softly, "I need you to step into the office." The walk to the office felt like the slow descent from a cliff. Chloe could feel the eyes of people who lived in rooms like this, professionals who judge everything by margin and presentation. Marco, the chef, caught sight of her in the pass and dropped a towel to his face with an expression that was half apology and half rage. Jessica averted her eyes. Hostesses are taught to be neutral as an act of self-preservation. Inside the small manager's office, Mr. Henderson's voice was quieter. There were prints of pastoral scenes on the wall and a small calendar where he kept the dates of holidays. He had a son in college and a tendency to hedge with kindness. "Sterling Vance called and said he was uncomfortable," he said. "He's threatening to take his table elsewhere and say a few things on Twitter about service." Chloe's jaw worked like a mechanism. She thought of her landlord's email about the overdue rent, and of the mattress that had begun to sag in the middle because replacing the straps had been delayed. She thought of calls from her sister about their mother, and the way the bills had quieted their laughter. She also thought of the grammar drills she'd done in the room in Moscow, when the snow pushed the world to the edges and she felt like someone building a bridge out of words. "I did nothing wrong," she said. The words were not defiance. They were a small, strict truth. Mr. Henderson looked at her as if trying to divide a pie into fairness and survival. "I know," he said, "but we have to think about the restaurant." "You're going to fire me?" Chloe asked, though the ledger in his face told the answer before it reached her ears. "I'm sorry," he said, the apology thin and ordered like napkin folds. "We can't risk the whole lunch rush. Please collect your things. We'll give you your last week's pay." She left the office with a paper envelope, a small, bureaucratic kindness that looked like an apology in itself. Sterling's table smirked when she passed, their attention returning like scavengers to an easy meal. The man in tweed watched her go with an expression that had longitude in it, as if he had measured the distance between his hand and the world's judgment and found it wanting. Outside, the city smelt of car exhaust and frying oil, the way afternoons smell when they hold the weight of other people's decisions. Chloe stood in the narrow alley behind the restaurant, the flap of her apron already forgotten in her hands. The envelope felt like paper-thin truth, money for the week, a resignation to the way the world turned. A kitchen door clanged. Marco leaned in and offered her a packet of cold fries wrapped in a napkin, an informal benediction. "Keep your head," he said. "They'll miss you." She wanted to laugh and she wanted to cry, and mostly she wanted to sink into whatever small anonymity would take her. But there was the taste still at the back of her mouth from the Russian words, the slight ache where a phrase had opened a door. She walked away from the alley and the racket of the street swallowed her almost immediately. The city was a louche animal at that hour. It swallowed the wrongs you could not pay for and spat out the rest at night. Chloe turned a corner and felt the familiar tug, a mind trying to add up debts against opportunities. She thought about the small ledger she kept in her head, Rent, medicine, phone bill, the quiet tuition payments she sent when she could. She thought about the way language had never been simply academic for her. It was a lens, a way to see things other people refused to examine. A taxi idled at the curb, and a man in a plain overcoat he had noticed from the restaurant, plain but with shoes that had been recently shined, watched her from across the street. She looked at him and then away, accusing her eyes of reading things that were not meant to be read. The world offered no angels, it offered only people who had the capacity to act. There was a sound, soft, precise, of a car door closing, and then footsteps. Chloe told herself she wanted nothing, that this was the last excursion of a woman who had been given enough exit points for one day. But the footsteps came closer. A voice, unfamiliar and accented, called, "Miss Evans?" She stopped. The name felt odd in someone else's mouth. The man in the overcoat had crossed the street and now stood in front of her, a slim envelope in his hand. He was not the shabby man from the restaurant. His coat was plain but expensive, his hair was cropped and tidy. He lifted the envelope and extended it without a flourish and without apology. On the flap was a small embossing, a wolf in profile, no more than a mark, elegant in its restraint. "I believe this fell from your hand," he said. The voice had the cool precision of someone who measured his words and his movements in the same currency. He did not smile. Chloe took the envelope reflexively and felt the weight of the moment, the way decisions sometimes arrive on paper and sometimes in the space between a breath and a reply. She wanted to tell him she was fine, that the envelope had everything she needed and more. She wanted to ask where the man in the tweed had gone, but she also had the exhaustion of someone who had been wronged and was still expected to be small about it. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head, an old-fashioned motion that made the moment feel like a curtain being drawn between scenes. "You have been very kind," he said. "Language is a precise tool. It reveals what people don't expect." Chloe did not answer, because she was not sure what answer the city was allowed to accept. She folded the envelope into her jacket and felt the impression of the embossing like a promise ground into paper. The man turned and started to walk away, the sound of his steps even on the pavement. "Wait," Chloe said, before she could weigh the consequences and store them for later. "Did you know him?" He paused without turning. The streetlight glazed his shoulders into outline. For a second, the man carried the same weight the tweed man had, and then he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I did," he said, and he knew better than most how the world measures people. "I was simply watching." Chloe's mind catalogued the sentence, placing the parts where she could compare them to the ledger in her head. Watching, not stepping forward, not changing the narrative, waiting for the right time to move. "Why did you?" she began, then stopped. She had no right to demand explanations from the architecture of other people's decisions, even if it felt like betrayal to be removed from her place in a room for the sake of someone else's test. He turned his face to her then, and for the first time she saw the trace of his features with intention, deep-set eyes that had seen more buildings than she had, a jaw that could carry the patience of someone who buys trouble at a discount and waits for interest. Because when people are tested by kindness, sometimes they pass not for the sake of reward, but because it is the right thing. And sometimes, he paused, searching for a word that sat like a coin between them. Sometimes it's necessary to rearrange the chessboard. Chloe could have been offended by the metaphor. She could have dismissed it as the speech of someone who was used to purchasing moral victories with strategy. Instead, she held the envelope against her chest and let the night air thicken. There is a kind of quiet that follows being dismissed. It sits with you like a patient thing and waits until you name it. Chloe called it hunger. She also called it obligation. She had not come to cities to be polite. She had come to pay for things that mattered. The man in the overcoat walked on. Chloe watched until the silhouette of his shoulders merged with the flow of other people's nights. She opened the envelope as if it were a sacred object and found inside a single card of thick paper. On it, in careful block letters, was an address and a time, and beneath it a line. For anyone who speaks another language with the patience of a person who owes the world nothing. There was no signature, only the small wolf embossing. The alley smelled of old oil and the small, clean scent of rain that had not yet come. Chloe folded the card into her palm and felt the ridges of the paper. The city continued in its indifferent orbit. Outside, a delivery truck backed into the curb with a roar. Life had not stopped to accommodate the moment. It had simply added it to a long list of things people would tell later on, if they remembered to tell. She could have crumpled the card and thrown it away. She could have folded herself into the shape of someone who took what life gave and called it fate. But she kept the card folded in her pocket, the way you keep a ticket stub from a night you might want to remember later. There was a strange mixture of shame and curiosity as steady under her ribs as an animal's heartbeat. For years, she'd guarded her knowledge like a small jewel, Russian being a private corridor that had let her slip away from rooms that were too bright. Today, the language had stepped into the light. Back inside, the restaurant served on, indifferent and efficient. Sterling returned to his table and ordered another glass of wine, triumphant in the way people are who think they've preserved the right order of things. Jessica reshelved her smile and adjusted the reservation book like a talisman. Marco dipped his head at the pass and set his knife down with a force that suggested he'd rather cut than speak. Chloe went home to a small apartment that looked across at the backs of other people's windows. She made tea and sat at her small kitchen table and let the steam fog the glass. That card lay between her hands like an unspoken invitation and a question. She had been taught to ration hope like currency. Tonight it did not feel like that. It felt like the start of something that demanded skill and will in equal parts. She thought of Dmitri Volkov and the way 2 syllables had altered a room. She thought of the man in the overcoat and the wolf on his card. She thought of the envelope that had landed in her palm like a small miracle or a small test. She was tired. She was also alert in the way of people who had learned their path by stumbling on rough stones and then learning to mark them. Chloe made a list, the practical kind. Rent, groceries, phone bill, a dry cleaning bill she had long put off. Beneath it, she wrote a different list, the private kind. Finish language course, apply for better shifts, find someone to help with her mother's appointments. Beneath that, in smaller handwriting, she wrote, "For the man in tweed, keep dignity, keep work, keep the path." There was a knock at her door. It startled her, the way a sudden noise startles the mind that has been in the habit of steady breathing. She opened it, and there, standing like someone who had been expected, was a delivery of small significance. A brown paper bag from Bramble and Finch, a slip of card tucked inside. She lifted the card. It said simply, in the same block letters, "Please come by tomorrow at noon. Consider this a new direction." It was a summons, carefully worded to leave room for dignity. She felt both rage and gratitude. The paper smelled faintly of cedar, as if it had been kept in a drawer of important things. Chloe looked toward the street and saw, across the way, a black car waiting like a patient animal. A door opened with precise, almost ceremonial ease. She did not know if she wanted to step into it. She did not know if the man inside was the same Dmitri Volkov who had been the shabby guest. She only knew that she had been given a choice she had not expected. Before she could decide, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her sister. "Are you okay? They told me you'd been let go. Call me." Chloe put the phone face down on the table and took the card again. The margin between what had been and what might be had shifted. Something that had felt unassailable became negotiable. There are moments when a life tilts and the room rearranges itself to find new centers. Chloe sat with the paper in her hands and thought of the grammar drills in the snow, of professors who had looked at her like an investment in the future, of the small, practiced kindness she had offered a man in a tweed coat. She thought about what people in rooms like Bramble and Finch called dignity, a discretionary thing that could be kept or given away. At 11:30 the next morning, Chloe put on a skirt she had never worn to the restaurant and a coat that had been pressed with an old care. She pinned her hair back with the same precise fingers she used to fold napkins. The envelope was in the inside pocket, warm from the seam. She walked out of her apartment and down the block, feeling the city's pulse beneath her steps, each one folding another possibility into a pocket of air. She reached the curb, and the black car opened its door, as if by choreography. The man who stepped out was not the shabby guest from yesterday. He wore a suit that had been cut around decisions, and a face that had the authority of someone who had moved money like weather. His eyes lifted to hers with recognition, but not surprise. He offered his hand, and she took it for a fraction, as if testing whether the ground beneath her had shifted. "Miss Evans," he said, in English that was carefully modulated, each syllable chosen. "My name is Dmitry Volkov." For a second, Chloe almost laughed at the coincidence of it. Yesterday's tweed man named in a voice that was now durable and newly appointed. The noise of the city became a background track. The moment sharpened. "You're the man from the restaurant," she said. It was not a question so much as a map being completed. She felt the slow unfurling of the odd geometry that had gathered them together. He nodded. "I prefer to see how people are when they are not certain they have anything to gain from me," he said. "But today I have a favor to ask, and perhaps an offer." There was no fanfare. There was only the thin line of a man offering an option with the gravity of an investment. Chloe understood, in the same way you understand weather, that something larger had moved. The language had opened a door. Now someone waited in the hall with a proposal that promised to rearrange rooms rather than sides. She wanted to ask how he knew she could speak, what gave him the right to redirect the rest of her day, whether this was an exercise in charity or a strategy. Instead, she settled for a question that had the practical weight of someone who measured things by bills. "Why me?" Dmitry's mouth formed a faint smile. "Because you are honest and you are patient," he said. "And because you speak Russian with the exactness of someone who learned not for show but for use. The city needs people who see small things clearly. I need someone who can speak for me where I am not wanted to appear." Chloe thought of the man in the restaurant again, of the tiny hands that had placed a napkin over the salt of embarrassment, and of a city that ignored the wrong ones until it suited them to notice. She had not imagined herself in the kinds of rooms Dmitry's voice suggested. She had not rehearsed the sharpness of the offers that sometimes arrive nested in a wolf's seal. She stepped into the car because the alternative was to let the moment pass and return to the habits that had kept her afloat. The leather was cool and smelled faintly of cedar, the same scent as the card. The door closed, and the world of concrete and pigeons and impatience slid away into glass. As the car moved through the city, Chloe felt the small list in her mind, the practical things that would suddenly look different if a day's wage could be traded for something larger. She thought of the obligations she could not avoid, the algebra of survival that had taught her precisely how much mercy to give herself. Behind her eyes, memories flickered, a professor's kind reprimand in a drafty lecture hall, the way grammar had sounded like architecture, the nights of study that had been both devotion and bargain. They arrived at an address that might have been the top floor of a building or the flat top of an entire story of the city. The elevator carried them upward with a quiet and deliberate hum. The buttons glowed like a small constellation. The doors opened onto a space that was unostentatious in its wealth, Art on the walls that looked like it was meant to be looked at, not owned. Books on the shelves that had been read. There were no guards posted like sentries. Instead, there was a sense of deliberate, unassuming taste. The sort that assumes power need not always be announced by sound. A woman received them at the door. Short, efficient, precise. Her name was Olga. She had the kind of efficient courtesy reserved for houses that had been built on habit and not on headline. Dmitri moved through the rooms with the ease of a man who understood the architecture of influence. Chloe felt like a small boat entering a harbor where the currents had been rearranged by larger tides. They came to a sitting room where two people were waiting, a man with the measured composure of a lawyer and another with the exacting expression of someone who had seen enough boardrooms to know the way men tilt under pressure. They introduced themselves in clipped professional ways. No small talk, only bones. Dmitri took a seat and offered Chloe tea. She accepted because politeness was the language of unknown rooms. He looked at her then with a steady regard and said, "I did not come to reward a kind act. I came to recruit talent." Talent. It was a word that had slippery edges. For Chloe, it meant languages and survival. For Dmitri, it meant strategy. For the man who watched Eugene's ledger of kindnesses and for the boardroom people who had learned how to take and how to give, talent was measured in returns. She held the cup and felt the warmth as if it might be an anchor against any sudden vertigo. "You speak more than Russian, I assume?" Dmitri asked. "Not much," Chloe said. "Just what I learned at university." He nodded, not discouraging the truth. "That is enough to begin. I want someone who can stand for me in certain formal rooms, someone who reads people, someone who does not mistake show for substance." Chloe's mind did the accounting. Each offer comes with a ledger, obligations on one side, benefits on the other. He told her that he had been watching the firm Sterling Vance worked with, an investment group that had been aggressive in the purchase of other people's weak votes, and that he needed a liaison who could sit in their spaces without attracting the immediate contempt a man like Dmitri could, at least not at first glance. "We are testing the waters," Dmitri said. He explained, in broad strokes, a plan that sounded more like chess than brute force. Buy debt at a discount. Once ownership is obtained, enact protections for the assets. Negotiate terms that would prevent the sort of exploitative breakup they had been conducting. He spoke carefully, translating business maneuvers into images Chloe could follow. Buttons to be pressed in the right order. Doors that needed locksmiths. Lights to be dimmed so the crowd would not notice the mover in the background. Chloe listened with the focus of someone who had been trained to watch and learn, who had been in classrooms where complex things were broken down until they became accessible. There were moments when her face would have betrayed ignorance, and Dmitri did not seem to mind. He spoke plainly when it mattered. "You will not be asked to do anything illegal," he said, as if that were a guarantee that needed making. "You will be asked to be honest, discreet, and to learn." The lawyer at Dmitri's side, a pale man in a dark suit, slid a small packet across the coffee table. Inside were mock-ups of boardroom memos, simplified summaries of debt instruments with the kind of language stripped to essentials: borrowed money, interest, collateral. They went through pages as one who teaches calculus might go through a child's arithmetic, step by step, jargon unsubstantialized into plain images. They were careful not to promise victory, only to set a map. The idea that someone like Chloe might be placed as a proxy in a boardroom where Sterling Vance and his ilk spoke easily was at once astonishing and quietly sensible. Men like Sterling assumed that anyone who entered a room without the brand-name suit could be pushed aside. They did not account for a woman who had learned to listen in other tongues, who had watched how people slid into truth when spoken to plainly. Chloe left the penthouse with the ink of a promise still warm in a brand-new notebook Dmitri had given her, a small thing with thick pages and a leather cover. She held it like a talisman and walked back into the afternoon with a new list at the center of the old ledger: learn, practice, perform. The world had shifted, Not the way a miracle shifts things, but the way a lever shifts a rock when it is found and used. Back on the street, the city had not changed its face. People still rushed with umbrellas and coffee and small, furious schedules. But for Chloe, the air felt altered. The possibility of a doorway hinged into a new gravity. She went home and sat at her kitchen table and opened the new notebook's first page. At the top, she wrote in large, careful letters, "Lessons." She began with the simplest. Keep dignity. Keep patience. Learn to speak power with a voice. Lessons, Chloe wrote at the top of the page, and beneath it the small list grew like an organized insurgency. Pronunciation drills, posture, numbers in plain English, when to look at a person and when to look at the paper. She underlined the last line twice, then closed the notebook and let the pen rest on the counter like a small flag. She slept poorly that night, not because she doubted the offer, but because possibility made the mind restless in the same way hunger does. The next morning she met Olga at the penthouse doors. Olga's efficiency had an unhurried rhythm to it. She spoke with the economy of someone who had seen the 5 stages of polite panic and decided, long ago, to move people through them without noise. Her instructions were simple. A driver would collect her every morning. Dmitri preferred mornings for discrete lessons. The training that followed was not the kind you could sum up in a single dramatic montage. It was 1,000 tiny violences against old habits and 1,000 small victories. Dimitri's team, lawyers, a quietly impatient strategist named Anton, and a woman called Lena who had the exacting eye of someone who had once worked in fashion, constructed a curriculum around the things Chloe needed that could not be bought in a classroom. How to occupy a room without taking it hostage. How to ask a question that made others reveal what they feared. How to make simple numbers sound inevitable. Voice lessons began first. A retired speech coach with a thin Oxford accent worked with Chloe on cadence and breath, on the way sentences could be weapons or bridges depending on how they were shaped. She learned to trim nervous flourishes and to place emphasis like punctuation. Dmitri listened more often than he spoke. When he did, his critiques were brief and unnerving. Fewer apologies, he would say, and she would feel the exactness of it sink into her. Then came the clothes. Lena treated Chloe's wardrobe like a field to be cultivated. She bought jackets with structure, skirts that hinted at precision rather than prettiness, shoes with careful, honest heels. The transformations were not merely cosmetic. Each garment altered the way a stranger read the woman standing in it. Where Chloe had learned to be small, the clothes asked her to present the size of her competence. But the hardest lessons were the ones built around paper. Mock boardroom sessions where the stakes were invented but felt real because men in suits behaved as if they were. Anton set up a series of rehearsals in which Chloe would sit at a long table opposite men trained to interrupt, to condescend, to pretend they owned both the air and the argument. On the first day, Chloe nearly dissolved under their practiced onslaught. She stumbled over a statistic and felt her face do the arithmetic of shame in public. Anton stopped the seam and, without condescension, walked her back through the numbers until they were domestic objects she could carry without breaking. They taught her debt instruments in plain images. Borrowing is like borrowing sugar. You promise to return it plus a little sweetness. Secured debt is sugar with a note saying where the sugar is stored. Covenants are the promises scribbled on the cupboard door. Dmitri asked for no illusions. You do not need to know every clause a lawyer can invent, he told her. You need to know what to look for that makes a person lie. Like what? She asked once, the pen poised. Like sudden sales of assets to related parties. Like payments that don't match revenues. Like loan covenants that are written to expire if the borrower breathes badly, he said. Start with the oddities, not with the platitudes. She learned to read between lines. In the simplified memos Anton slid across the coffee table, she learned to spot patterns. A company posting strong sales while its cash dwindled. A board that passed decisions without minutes. A junior partner writing off risks as temporary adjustments. Each anomaly had a shape she learned to love, because a shape could be shown to others, and when shown plainly, it convinced. There were tempering mites as well. She practiced being interrupted and smiling, practicing the tilt of a head that signals attention rather than submission. She practiced firmness that never became venom. "People confuse calm with weakness," Dmitri said once, watching her steady her hands. "That is why quiet is a kind of power." For all the useful brutality of lessons, there were softer parts. Dmitri's house smelled of ink and boiled tea. Sometimes he would walk through a bookcase and pull out a collection of essays on moral philosophy, as if to remind her the mind had to be trained toward wisdom, not merely competence. He rarely told stories of his own past in any fullness. When he did, it was to say, once, "I have seen people use power as a test. I prefer it as a tool." The sentence was not a confession, but a corner of one. As the days folded into a practiced routine, Chloe's confidence accumulated as if by small deposits. She learned to lean into a question and to watch for the flinch. She learned that numbers that seemed tidy could hide their own rips. She learned to treat every file with the politeness of someone who assumes it knows more than it shows. Between sessions, Dmitri's aides fed her, metaphorically and literally. Olga insisted she eat properly. Lena taught her which shoes would not betray a long afternoon. Anton corrected her notes with a scholar's patience. The penthouse felt like a monastery of preparation, a rigor that was quiet yet clinical. There were setbacks. On a day when she meant to recite the ratio of debt to equity as if it were scripture, her tongue betrayed her and she stumbled over terms Anton had said were the keys to authority. She left the room with cheeks burning as if someone had scalded them gently. Dmitri found her on the terrace, looking out over the city with a kettle of half-forgotten tea. "You will fail sometimes," he said, not unkindly. "We have to make it acceptable." "How do you make a city accept you?" she asked. "You make the people in the room accept you first," he said. "Then the city follows." On others, she surprised herself. After hours poring over a set of financial statements, she called Anton into the room and, with a steadier voice than her own thoughts had expected, showed where Sterling Vance's firm had, over a period of months, shifted liabilities into subsidiaries no one looked at. She explained plainly what that meant, that in a crunch, the main firm could claim its books were healthy, while side vehicles hid the actual obligations. Anton's pale face thinned with approval. He tapped the paper in the place she indicated and said, "She sees it." Word reached the corners of the firm where Sterling worked. Within weeks, Dmitri's team had quietly purchased a tranche of distressed debt connected to an acquisition Sterling's firm had engineered the year before. It was a move the newspapers would later call prescient. For the moment, it was a chess move played out in silence. Chloe's role was simple and crucial. She would be the face of an offer that would be made with the bluntness of documents and the discretion of a hand on a scale. The evening before the decisive meeting, Chloe sat up late in the penthouse, reading through the binder Anton had assembled for her. The binder was thick with exhibit tabs and simplified charts. She read not for rote memorization, but to let the logic enter her bones. Each page was a tiny convincing. Figures, timelines, email excerpts contrived into a clear chain. Evidence that the firm had overextended, that assets had been siphoned, that certain votes were subject to influence not disclosed. The documents were not traps for the unsuspecting. They were mirrors you could hold up to the room and force it to acknowledge what it already knew but had chosen not to call by name. Dmitri knocked once on her door before he entered. He wore a jacket that had softened at the shoulders with practice. There was no grand pep talk. He set a cup of tea at her elbow and watched her for a moment with an expression that contained neither pity nor grandiosity. "You will be my voice," he said. "No one will expect that voice to belong to the thing that bought the debt." "And if they do not listen?" she asked. "Then you will show them the ledger," he said. "And if they do not believe the ledger, then I will show them that I own the ledger." Her sleep that night was a different sort, less restless, charged now with the taste of purpose. In the morning, a driver took them downtown. The bank where Sterling and Magnus Holloway held sway was an old building with recent renovations. Marble steps, a glass atrium that promised transparency and subtly suggested it did not owe the public explanations. Security checked their names against a list. She had her ID, a temporary proxy letter, and the air of someone who had rehearsed calm until it looked like an instinct. Inside the anteroom, the lawyers smoked quiet cigarettes, metaphorical ones perhaps, and the men who would be present for Sterling's defense checked watches and phones. Chloe felt the pressure like a hand at the base of her skull. Anton pinched her shoulder with the familiarity of someone who knows to be firm in small ways. "You are ready," he said. She nodded, though a part of her still felt like the woman who carried receipts in her apron pocket. She knew not to let that part show. Dmitri had taught her to let history be a reservoir, not a liability. The conference room was longer than she had expected and smelled faintly of citrus cleaner, a new smell meant to suggest hygiene. Sterling Vance arrived with the practiced pomposity of a man who believed a room could be won with volume. He was flanked by a small retinue, a young associate who laughed too easily at his jokes, a woman who took notes like she was filing away the world. Magnus Holloway sat at the head of the table, an image of measured power with the silent instruments of seniority. Phones were set down with care. A projector hummed. Chloe entered last. It was not that she arrived late, it was that she stepped in with a timing that had been taught to disarm. Where others expected a gray-haired emissary to represent Dmitri, they found a woman in a structured jacket, hair pinned simply, holding a leather binder. Her face did not announce the man behind her. It suggested the competence of someone who had been waiting to be needed. There was a beat of confusion from Sterling as his practiced smile faltered. He had rehearsed condescension. He had not rehearsed the quiet steadiness of a woman who could ask him to explain, patiently, why certain numbers did not add. Chloe opened her binder. She began not with accusations, but with the obvious, a timeline. She spoke in plain sentences that an office clerk could follow and a CFO could not deny. She laid out a series of transactions that, at a glance, seemed reasonable, but, when walked through step by step, revealed a pattern of redirected cash flows and obscured obligations. She turned pages to exhibit tabs with charts that simplified ratios. Revenue north, but cash in the wrong accounts. Sister companies with loans written off as intercompany adjustments. A covenant that had quietly expired because no one had thought to publish the notice. She translated legalese into common sense as if she were a teacher explaining an arithmetic trick. Sterling's face began to twist in stages. Surprise, then irritation, then the practiced anger that reads as confidence. He interrupted once, twice, calling out that Chloe was out of her depth. The room hummed with the sound of men aligning behind a familiar narrative. A woman could be dismissed if she could be made to seem unprepared. Chloe kept her voice calm. She asked for copies of certain internal memos and let silence be a question that hung in the air. Men in the room shifted. They chose sides without signaling. Then Anton's phone buzzed. A brief, carefully worded message. Dmitri had finalized a purchase. Enough of the debt to take effective control of the assets under dispute. The signal was a small thing, a note passed on a tablet, yet its consequences were enormous. In the practical vocabulary of finance, it meant the lever Dmitri had purchased was now in his hand. In the language of the room, it meant a quiet reordering had occurred, and the men who had assumed they held the strings were in fact standing on one end of them. Dmitri did not enter the room. Instead, a short video conference pinged and his face appeared on the screen. Calm, distant, authoritative. He spoke in Russian for a sentence, and Chloe watched the immediate reassessment on the faces of several of the older men who had, for a moment, thought of the shabby guest as nothing. He then switched to English. "You have traded short-term profits for structural risk," he said. His voice was even. "We will not break this company. We will not allow reckless asset stripping. We have acquired the debt necessary to enforce protections. Our terms are clear. We will negotiate reasonable governance changes and protections for employees with the removal of individuals whose conduct has endangered the firm. We will not tolerate manufactured votes or undisclosed related party transactions." The words landed like a series of well-aimed coins. The board members glanced at one another, the calculus now forced into daylight. Sterling's face turned from red to a thinner color, like the sound of metal being pared down. He protested, of course. Indignation is a practiced coat one puts on when being embarrassed. He called the move opportunistic, personal, something about hostile tactics. But the documents Chloe had laid out were the spine of a legitimate case. They were not a lampoon, they were a diagnostic. In the minutes that followed, the room cleaved into a kind of slow chemical reaction. Magnus Holloway, who had seen the arc of aggressive junior partners before, understood the hazard. A scandal left unchecked could erode the firm's relationships more than any short-term profit. He had a reputation to keep, and reputations are fragile things that fracture easily in the public glare. He began, delicately, to argue for an orderly recalibration rather than open warfare. He suggested the board convene a committee, that an independent auditor be appointed. He spoke of stakeholders and letters to pension funds. His tone had the diplomacy of a man trying to make sure everyone could save something. Sterling, however, was cornered by his own patterns. His habit had been to devalue anyone who might question him, to call them sentimental or inexperienced. Now those tactics failed because the evidence was not sentimental. It was factual, concise, and presented without melodrama. Chloe answered questions crisply. She spoke to a line item here, a payment there, and when Sterling attempted to call her out on a technicality, she calmly referred to the exhibit and said, "This is what is on the record. If you have evidence to contradict it, please present it." Her steadiness was itself a kind of strategy. It forced others to move from theatrical displays to paperwork, and paperwork has the inconvenient habit of being boringly true. At one point, Sterling rose and paced, his voice rising. He accused Dmitri of being manipulative. Dmitri listened from the screen, and, when he replied, did so with mildness that was more devastating than anger would have been. "We are not here to punish," he said. "We are here to correct. If people have acted wrongfully, there will be appropriate steps. If the firm wants to resist reform, they will face the consequences of that choice." The consequence was not merely moral. Because Dmitri now controlled a block of debt, he had leverage, legal, financial, and reputational. He could foreclose, demand board seats, or force a restructuring that would protect assets and employees rather than allowing opportunistic breakups that benefited a few at the cost of many. It was leverage used like a scalpel rather than a bludgeon. As the hours wore on, the initial drama thinned into a negotiation. Magnus, practical and self-interested, proposed a compromise. Sterling would step away from direct operational control pending an inquiry. An independent trustee would oversee certain transactions. Several protective covenants would be embedded to protect the company's assets and employees. In return, Dmitri would withdraw public threats and commit to governance that would allow the firm to maintain client relationships. Sterling protested, but his allies had been limited by the clarity of the evidence and by the fear of reputational damage. One by one, his defenses collapsed into the kind of small concessions men expect when the balance of power shifts in ways they did not anticipate. He was not dragged out in disgrace. There was no dramatic physical ejection. He was instead asked to step aside in terms that would be framed as protective of the firm. Because the firm's public face mattered, and because the people in power preferred to preserve appearances even as they rearranged them. When the room dissolved into quiet signatures and carefully worded minutes, Chloe felt relief the way a tide recedes. Not triumph, but the return of balance. Anton squeezed her hand under the table in a small, sharp gesture that felt like approval. Dimitri's face on the screen held a small, almost unnoticeable lift of the mouth. He did not gloat. He never did. On the ride back to the penthouse, Chloe thought about how thin the seam is between justice and spectacle. She had seen both, the hungry spectacle that thrives on humiliation, and the quieter justice that repairs. Today had been the latter. The men who had looked at a man's coat and written a story had been shown a ledger they could not prefer against the truth. That felt, to Chloe, less like vengeance and more like restitution. In the days that followed, the firm rearranged itself. Magnus Holloway took a more overt leadership role in shepherding the company through the transition. An independent auditor arrived, and employees were called into meetings where, for the first time in a long while, executives had to answer direct questions about certain transactions. Sterling Vance, while not ruined, found doors closing in ways he had not anticipated. The invitation to a certain club delayed, a favored client requesting a different point of contact. Pride is an asset that can become a liability when markets shift. People who once mattered began to find themselves less so. Chloe was offered a position that sat somewhere between executive liaison and head of stakeholder communications for Dimitri's portfolio company. It was a role he described plainly. She would be the face that bridged languages and rooms. She would ensure governance promises were kept and that the human consequences of fiscal decisions were considered. It was work she had not expected to be asked to do, but once she felt the scale of the harm the firm had allowed, she accepted. Her acceptance, however, did not mean she disappeared from the lives she had left behind. On her first day after the formalities, she walked back into Bramble and Finch with a small envelope for Marco. He was manning the pass, his expression cautious at first as he took in her changed posture and the suits that accompanied her. She handed him the envelope, and inside was a letter of recommendation and an offer. A new small kitchen in a place Dimitri planned to open that would feature his food and give him a role to manage. Marco's face, for once, did not hide anything. He smiled, a wide thing that carried both astonishment and gratitude. Mr. Henderson and Jessica were more complicated. Chloe arranged a meeting with them in a corner of the restaurant after hours. She could have entered with an air of punishment. Instead, she chose a calm interrogation of choices. "You were between a table and a decision," she told Mr. Henderson. "You chose the table." He did not deny it. "I have a mortgage," he said. "I thought of my son, of payroll." The admission was not an excuse, but an account. Chloe listened. She then explained, without gloating, what she'd seen at the bank, and how the firm's actions had endangered many more people than a lunch rush. Mr. Henderson, who had a human tendency toward the pragmatic, asked what could be done. They negotiated a restitution plan. Dimitri's firm, in the course of the governance changes, committed to a small fund to help staff transition when needed and to support training for employees who wanted to improve their prospects. Mr. Henderson would keep his job, provided he adopted clearer policies about dignity on the floor and instituted an internal complaint process that did not favor wealthy patrons. It was not punishment, it was a structural correction. Chloe returned to the restaurant a few times in the months that followed, not as a triumphant conqueror, but as someone checking on the small ecosystem that had once been her entire world. She brought Marco to inspect the new kitchen space Dimitri's team had secured, an intimate place with worn wood and a real oven. She watched Jessica learn a new script in customer care and thought about how habits, once rearranged, could create new rhythms. Sterling's downfall became a cautionary tale in certain circles, mentioned with the thin satisfaction of those who enjoy narratives with tidy ends. Chloe, however, felt no hunger for survivors gloating. The lesson she hoped people took away was quieter. Watch what you do when power is within you. Kindness is evidence of character, and sometimes the world rearranges itself not because of spectacle, but because small, persistent truths are finally presented plainly. Months later, when the company had settled into the first round of governance changes and the news articles had stopped counting headlines, Chloe sat in Dimitri's office, a place that had become part of her new geography, and watched sunlight fall across a shelf of books. A letter from her sister lay on the desk, the tone of it both practical and tender. Her mother's health had improved with better care, paid in part by the fund they'd established. The ledger she kept in her head started, at last, to change shape. Fewer red marks, new columns of possibility. Dimitri entered without announcement, as he often did. He carried 2 cups of tea and 1 small, neat box wrapped in plain paper. He handed a cup to Chloe and set the box between them. "You have done what you were asked and more," he said. "You were honest about what you didn't know, and you learned. That is a rare combination." Her face, for a moment, showed the soft complexity of someone who felt gratitude and awkwardness in equal measure. "You could have simply bought the debt and forced the change," she said. "Why involve me at all?" He looked out the window for a long breath. "Because part of the work was to change how people perceived consequence," he said. "The city listens to spectacle, but it obeys truth when it sees it told plainly by someone who was once on its margins. You changed a narrative that night in the restaurant. I only amplified the fact that it could be different." She opened the box. Inside was a small notebook with a wolf embossed on the cover, the same wolf she had seen on the envelope months before, and a fountain pen. On the first page, someone had written in Dimitri's precise hand a single sentence: "Keep dignity, keep patience, speak plainly." Chloe closed the book and, for once, did not write. She simply held it until the pen's weight reminded her there were more entries to be made. Outside, the city moved in its habitual indifference. Inside, a hand steady enough to write truth into paper had been given the instruments to do so. There were small epilogues for others. Marco's restaurant opened and, true to the quiet way the world sometimes returns favors, gained a loyal neighborhood crowd. Jessica took a course in hospitality management offered through the employee fund and later managed a team with a steadier smile. Mr. Henderson, chastened but wiser, instituted a staff advocate role that altered the floor's culture. Sterling found that certain doors closed for him and that some reputations are hard to rebuild once questions are raised. Magnus Holloway retained much of his influence, but now with a more public accountability that tempered his instincts. Chloe did not stay in the role forever. The work was exhausting in a way that drained the marrow. Being the bridge between 2 very different kinds of worlds required compromises she had not anticipated. But she left on terms that felt like agency. She negotiated an exit after a few years that allowed her to open a community language center where people could study practical languages for work, English, Russian, and others, and where tuition would be subsidized for low-income students. The center was small, run with the same simple dignity she cherished, and on its opening day, Dimitri attended, inconspicuous and brief, as if to say he believed in the projects he had funded beyond any interest they might return. On the day she walked back into Bramble and Finch for what she expected might be a final hello, the room greeted her like a place that had been weathered by the same seasons as she had. There was a familiarity in the clink of plates, in Marco's quick, almost imperceptible salute. She found Mr. Henderson at the floor and thanked him for making changes that mattered. They spoke plainly of compromises and human limits. Neither tried to pretend the past had not been difficult. Chloe left a small stack of discount vouchers for staff training and a note for Jessica tucked into the reservation book, for training and front-of-house scholarship. As she stepped out into the city again, the light made the buildings look like copper plates, oxidized and rich. The wolf on her notebook glinted in the sun. For years, she had carried a private altar of language in her head, the grammar rules and the lectures and the nights in Moscow. That altar had not been the center of a miracle. It had been the site of a decision she had made repeatedly: to hold on to a skill even when it seemed irrelevant, to treat compassion as an act of cost, and to invest in patience when the currency around her paid only for loudness. In the end, the story that started with a coat and a laugh resolved not in spectacle, but in the slow rearrangement of rooms. The arrogant voice that had once mocked a man's tweed became a softer, more circumspect tone in certain circles. The man in the tweed, Dmitry Volkov, remained a paradox: generous in a strategic way, exacting in his moral calculations, and unwilling to allow power to be an excuse for cruelty. Chloe found work that let her teach others the quiet power of language and watch them use it not as a weapon but as a key. If you liked this tale of quiet reversal and practical dignity, consider subscribing for more stories where small kindnesses reshape the rooms we live in. Months afterward, Chloe kept the notebook on her kitchen table. On one of its pages, she had written a sentence that sometimes she read in the evenings when the city loomed large and the night cracked open with possibility. It is possible to change who gets seen simply by insisting the lens be refocused. The last image is small, private. Chloe walking past the restaurant at dusk, the lights warm in the windows, a scarf tightened against the wind. Inside, people ate and laughed with the low hum of ordinary life. A man at the counter, new shoes and a tired face, asked for tea. Chloe paused at the doorway, watched him get served, and stepped into the room not as someone to correct, but as someone who had once been corrected by kindness and answered in kind. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in her shoes? If this story spoke to you, leave a like and subscribe for more.